OpenAI recently released an incredible new experimental tool called Swarm, which makes it so easy to create a bunch of AI agents that work together to do some really incredible things. The problem is, you have to use OpenAI models like GPT-4o by default. But what if you want to use Ollama to create swarms of agents all running locally on your machine? Well, that is exactly what I'm going to show you how to do today. I took my SQL AI agents that I built in my last video on Swarm, and I made some really simple changes to make all the agents run locally with Ollama, which, by the way, Ollama supports function calling in the exact same format as the OpenAI models. I am super excited to show this to you today because function calling and agents, they take up a lot of tokens, and so using Swarm with GPT is definitely not cheap. But with Ollama, it is completely free, and in my initial testing, I've gotten some really good results, even with the smaller models. I'll start by walking you through the very simple changes that I made to make Swarm work with Ollama. Then I'll go step by step through how to install and run this yourself from scratch, so you can get up and running, creating AI agent swarms with local LLMs. So let's go ahead and dive right into it. So if you haven't seen my other video on Swarm yet, I would highly recommend checking that out because I dive deep into what it looks like to actually create a bunch of AI agents to make a swarm with this tool. And so right here, and what I'm going to show you now is going to be a more higher level how to integrate with Ollama to run your agents locally. But if you're curious how to actually use this platform, I've got a video on that. It is so easy, and they've got great documentation in the repository as well for how to set up these agents and link them all together. They also have this example folder right here, so you can see a ton of different examples for different use cases and how you can build those all with Swarm. So with that being said, I'm going to dive into the Ollama side of things now. So there's this article that was published on July 25th of this year. So pretty recently, Ollama added tool support. And the very important thing that I want to call out here, you'll see why I'm referencing this in just a second. If I scroll down to the bottom of this article on tool calling, you'll see here that they have OpenAI compatibility. And what that means is that I can act like I'm sending a request to GPT, for example, but I override the URL that the API goes to use Ollama instead of OpenAI. And it's essentially just with this code right here. So you even import the OpenAI library and you set up the chat completion just like you would when you're calling GPT in your code. But you change the base URL to point to localhost port 11434 where Ollama is hosted by default on your machine. And if you have this set up on a different port or have Ollama hosted externally on another machine, you can change this URL to be whatever it needs to be to connect to your Ollama instance. It is that simple. And so I'm going to tie this together with Swarm to show you what exactly we have to change. Because take a look at this file right here. So I'm back in the Swarm repository looking at the source code now. And here you can see where that OpenAI instance is set up. So in the default setup for Swarm, it instantiates a client with no parameters, which means it just looks for your OpenAI API key environment variable for authentication, and there's no base URL override. So it's just going out to the OpenAI API. Now to change this, all we have to do is implement what they show right here in the Ollama documentation. It's that simple. We just have to change the base URL and then the API key. That's it. And that is what I'm going to show you how to do in a little bit here so that we can basically instantiate a swarm. We don't even have to change the swarm code. I'm not making a fork or anything. We just have to, when we instantiate our swarm, pass in our client. That's going to be an Ollama client. And that is what I'm going to show you how to do. All right, so here I am in the SQL AI agent Swarm code that I showed in the last video that I made on Swarm. And there's just a few simple changes that I'm going to show you now to make it all work with Ollama, going off of what I just covered. And so first of all, I want to say that all of this code I'm going to have available in GitHub. I'll have a link in the description of the video. And so later in this video, when I show you how to get everything up and running, you can download it all from GitHub and follow my instructions and have this for yourself really easily. The first thing that I made as a change to this is I added an environment variable file, similar to a lot of other tutorials on my channel. And since Ollama doesn't need an API key, there's no key you have to set here, but you can define the environment variable that determines the model that you are going to use as kind of like your default model for your agents. So I love using Qwen 2.5 Coder. It's also a 7 billion parameter model. It's smaller, it's really nimble, it works really, really well for this agent here, which is generating SQL statements. And so it's kind of coding. And so I love using that model for this agent right here. And so I pull that model, and then down in the code here, again, I go into all this code in a lot more detail in my other video. I define the model for each one of my agents. And so these ones right here are all using that default model defined in my environment variable. But you can also set up your agents to use other models. So my router agent, I just want a really, really lightweight agent because it's not going to make any tool calls besides transferring to other agents. So I'm using a 3 billion parameter model. So another really cool thing about running this all with Ollama is you can have all your agents running on a ton of different models. Like you can have Qwen for some, or you could use Mistral for some of your other agents. And you can do that with OpenAI as well, but your options are pretty limited to, oh, I want to use 4.0 mini for this agent, and then 4.0 for this agent. But with Ollama, you have dozens and dozens, even hundreds of options for models for all your agents, which is really, really cool. And then for the script right here, run.py, where I actually create my Swarm instance, this is where I establish the OpenAI instance, where I'm referencing a new base URL and API key, just like we saw in that Ollama blog article when they released tool calling support. So I set up my instance like this. Usually the default in Swarm is just like this, where there's no parameter supplied. So I add in everything for Ollama. And then where I instantiate my Swarm instance right here, this is where I pass in the client. And so if you don't give anything at all, that's the default setup. It just uses OpenAI and their API, but now I'm using Ollama. That is the only change I have to do. So it's just wherever you use your Swarm and set it up with this call, you pass in a new client, point it to Ollama, and that is it. You are now good to go. That is literally the only change we have to do. And all this code that you see right here for running a demo loop, I just took this from the OpenAI Swarm repository. So they have all this code for you. So I just copied it into my own version right here. And then this is the only change I had to make along with this new client right here. And that is it. So now we can go ahead and test this out and actually use our local models for our agents. Okay, so that you know what is actually going on with this testing that I'm about to show with Ollama, let's quickly go over what this agent swarm is actually doing. So let's say we have an RSS feed database. An RSS feed is just a way to get a bunch of articles from a news source like the NVIDIA blog, for example. We want to store all these articles in a database, and maybe we're creating a whole platform around giving news to users where we have a user table, and then we have these feeds and all the articles that are linked to these feeds. We have this all stored in a database right here. And now what we want to do is create a bunch of agents that help us query the database to get information that we need for analytics or seeing how many users we have engaging with different articles, all that kind of good stuff. Now, the problem is if you have one agent that is operating on this database and has to make all these different types of SQL queries to get this information, it can be overwhelming to the LLM. So the solution here to make the agent perform better is to split it up into multiple agents. So we have this router agent that takes in the initial request from the user, and it determines which specialized agent is going to best be able to create a SQL query, a select statement, to answer the question for the user. And so this router will say, oh yeah, the user is asking something related to RSS feeds. So I'll transfer the request to the RSS feed agent, which is going to create that query in real time to query the RSS feed database, get the response back, and then answer the user's question. Or if it's an analytics related question, like engagement with these news articles, then it will go to the analytics agent, which will make an analytics type query, maybe joining on a bunch of different tables, and then transferring the request back to the router and answering the question to the user. So you can see here that also each of these agents is going to be able to be instructed in a different way. And so like one thing I did in my previous video with the RSS feed agent is I made it always talk about how excited it is about all the RSS feeds, which is just like a silly little example to show that you can set the behavior for all these different agents. So not only are you splitting up these agents into more specialized parts of this database, but you're also able to instruct them on how to answer questions differently because maybe you'd want to answer an analytics question in a much different way than you'd want to answer a question about users on the platform. So that is this agent in a nutshell, and that is what we're going to test right now with local models. All right, in the terminal now, all we have to do to spin this up is run the run.py Python script. And this is going to kick off that swarm instance that's using the Ollama base URL, and then run in that loop there where we're able to infinitely ask questions to our router agent that will direct to one of those specific agents to make that query, answer our question based on the data. So let's go ahead and run this. And this is all using local models. I'm using Qwen 2.5 3B for the router, and then Qwen 2.5 Coder 7B for our agents writing the SQL queries. And so we can start off really simple with a query like how many users are on the platform. And because this is running locally on my computer, and I don't have the beefiest machine right now, it actually takes a little bit. So let me pause and come back once this is done. All right, so about 15 seconds later, and it routed to the user agent, which is great. And then it ran this, just getting a simple count from the database and then answering my question. There are currently 5 users on the platform. Absolutely fantastic. Let's go ahead and run another test here. All right, so what I just did was pretty simple, but I wanted to start out with something basic, especially because we're using some very small models here. But let's try to push the limits a little bit more. So again, I'm not going to be really complicated with these queries, but I still want to have some sort of query generated with some table joins, something that's at least a little bit non-trivial. And so now I'm going to say, do some analytics for me. I want to know what the most popular RSS feed is. So I want it to transfer to my analytics agent now and generate a query that'll actually have to pull data from different tables and combine it together to get a much more intelligent response than just how many users are on the platform. So I'll pause and come back again once that is done. All right, so about 10 seconds later, and we now have our answer. So transfer to the analytics agent, looking really good. It made a select statement that's a bit more complicated now. It has a join on the feeds view. And yeah, so it's not as basic as just doing a count star on a single table, and it got the right response. The most popular RSS feed is ML Weekly with 6 views. And this is just using a bunch of mock data that I had Claude 3.5 Sonnet create for me. So this is looking absolutely fantastic. And these local models are kicking butt. Like having a 7 billion parameter model, that is so tiny compared to GPT, but it's still able to do really well with my SQL agents here. And just for your information, I'm running a laptop with a 3060 GPU, and it's able to run these 7 billion and 3 billion parameter models really quickly. If you wanted to try something even bigger, like a 32 billion parameter model, like CodeLlama, for example, you'd probably need something larger like a 3080 or 3090 graphics card. It all depends on the model you want to use, but these smaller models can run on like almost any computer. Like I'm just even using a laptop here, and they still work really well. Very last thing, I want to show you how to run this all yourself from scratch so you can get up and running with your Ollama Swarm agents. And so to get Ollama installed, all you have to do is go to ollama.com and click on this nice big download button. This will install for your operating system as well. So it works for Mac, Linux, and Windows. And all the instructions that I have here, I'll show you how to do everything on the different operating systems when it applies. I'm setting this up on Windows, but you're going to be able to do this on Linux and Mac as well. So go ahead and download Ollama, and then we'll go on to the next step. All right, so now we're going to pull the Git repository that I have with all the code. The prerequisites here is that you have Python and Git installed. I don't include that in this walkthrough here because it's super simple. You just have to Google both of those and get those installed on your machine. Really easy setup no matter your operating system. Then what we're going to do is clone my repository here. And so it's git clone, and then just the URL that we have here for the AI Agents Master class repo where I'm storing all my code for all my different videos. So you're just going to clone that. I already have this, that's why I get this error here, but if you don't, you'll clone that, and then you just want to change your directory into this local swarm agent folder that has all the code for the SQL agents that I just showed you running with Ollama. Next up, what you want to do is create a Python or virtual environment. This is going to be an isolated place for you to install all the requirements for running this Python script specifically. And so the way that you do that is python-mvenv, and then the name of your virtual environment. A good default is just to call it venv. And so you'll run this command. I already have that ran as well, so I'm not going to run it, but it'll create your virtual environment, and then you can go ahead and activate it to switch your terminal into that specific environment, so the Python packages will be isolated that will install in a little bit here. So using virtual environments is just how you make sure that you can have different projects all using different packages and different versions for packages, so that you don't break one project on your system by updating packages for another. Keeping it all isolated is very, very important, which is why I'm focusing on it here. A super big thing that Python beginners miss out on. So make sure you do that. The next thing that we want to do is activate this virtual environment. On Windows, all you have to do is do dot slash and then the name of your virtual environment that you just created, scripts, and then activate. Boom, there we go. So we've now activated our virtual environment. You can see here on the left-hand side that it says we are in the environment now. If you are on Linux or Mac, the command for this is a little bit different. I'll go ahead and copy this and show just what that looks like really quickly. It is source and then the name of your environment /bin/activate. Obviously, this is not going to work on Windows here, but that's what you do for Linux and Mac. Then what we want to do is take the requirements.txt file that I have in the repo, which tells you all the packages and their versions that you need, and we want to install that with pip. So pip comes default to your Python installation. It's their package manager, kind of like cargo for Rust or npm for JavaScript. So I'll do pip install -r requirements.txt. This is going to go through all the packages there and their specific versions, so that you're going to have the exact same setup that I have when I showed everything in this video. So that's how you know that everything is going to work exactly the same. And so first it's going to install Swarm from the OpenAI Git repository, and then all of the other dependencies that I already have installed. But in your case, if you don't have them installed yet in this virtual environment, it'll take a little bit longer. And that is it. So now the next thing that we have to do is go over to our env example file. So this is another file in the repo, just like we have this requirements.txt file. You're going to rename this file to .env and then set the Ollama model that you want to use. So going back to Ollama, let me show you really quickly how we can actually pull these models now that we have Ollama installed. So I'm going back to my browser here, and I'm going to show you this page right here. So if you go to, and I'll have a link to this in the description as well. If you go to ollama.com/search, and you go to the Tools tab right here, it is going to show you all of the models that you can install with Ollama that support tool calling. You need this for Swarm, because if you have a model that doesn't support tool calling, it's not going to be able to actually act as an agent and invoke the tools that you have set up in your Swarm code. So you need specifically a model that has the tool label here. That is really, really important. So, for example, Qwen 2.5 is one of my favorites. In fact, I think it actually performs even better than Llama 3.2 and 3.1. So you click into the one that you want, and then you select the number of parameters that you want. So if you have a weaker computer, you might want to use like 7 billion or below. If you have something really, really powerful, like double 3090 GPU setup, you could use like, 32 or 72 billion parameters. So you select the one that you want, and then after you select it, you can copy this ID right here. And so actually, let me just copy this right here. So I don't want to run it. I just want to pull it. So let me copy this ID right here. And then going back into the terminal, what I can do is I can say Ollama pull and then Qwen 2.5 3B. So in my case, I already have this installed. And so that's why this worked like instantaneously. But if you don't have it installed already, it'll take a while to pull these models because they're actually all multiple gigabytes, even the 3 billion parameter ones. And so you have the model now and you are good to go. So what you can do is go back to your code here, and then that same ID that you used to pull the model with Ollama, you put that in here for the LLM model. So that will now be the default Ollama model that these agents use within Swarm. And then also, like I showed earlier, if you want to pull other models and set them here manually for the agents that you create, you can do that. And that is how I was able to use the default model for some of these agents, and then for the router, I had it hard-coded here to use Qwen 2.5 3B. You could also, if you want to, set up multiple environment variables, like you could say router LLM, and then the agent LLM. You could set this up however you want. This is just an example here, but that is how you pull the Ollama models and use them within the Swarm here. And that is everything. Make sure you rename this to .env, and then you can go through the exact same process I did with my demo, where I ran the run.py script, and I tested out my agents, and everything was working really, really well. The future of local LLMs is looking really bright, and I find it incredible that you're able to do this kind of thing with even smaller models running on your computer. Now, you're still going to get better performance with GPT compared to a model like Qwen. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. But the gap between open source and the massive closed source models is diminishing really, really quickly. It's super exciting stuff, and I hope that you had a blast playing around with AI agents with Swarm running locally, just like I did. If you appreciated this content and you're looking forward to more local AI content, I would really appreciate a like and a subscribe. And with that, I will see you in the next video.